Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, brought to you by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley. This episode of the Accounting Technology Lab is brought to you by Tax Bandits. If you're feeling the pressure of juggling 1099s and W-2s, listen up. Tax Bandits is the solution you've been waiting for. With over a decade of experience, they support e-filing for over 100 federal and state tax forms. Tax Bandits is IRS certified, meaning they offer instant form processing and real-time status updates. For peace of mind, Tax Bandits provides TIN matching, USPS address validation, and the Bandit commitment. Their promise to stand behind your filings, including free corrections, retransmissions, all backed by their money-back guarantee if a form can't be accepted or duplicated. Plus, delivering recipient copies is easy with postal, mailing, or online access. Tax professionals can also enjoy pro features like secure client portal, team management tools, and branding customization. If you're ready to take control of tax season and join thousands of tax professionals who trust Tax Bandits, head on over to taxbandits.com. That's TAXBANDITS.com. And we thank Tax Bandits for their support of the Accounting Technology Lab.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm your host, Randy Johnston, with co-host Brian Tankersley. And we're coming to you live from CES 2026. And we wanted in this episode to talk to you about infrastructure improvements. Now, one of the things we both noticed is that AI applications were moving out to the edge. And we've talked to you about that in some length in various sessions, noticing it first in 2016. So it's been 10 years in the making, Brian.
It has, but it's funny. It's gone out to the cloud and it's come back on-prem now. And it came back on-prem for some of the concerns we had about putting all of our naughty bits out there.
Yeah. And so one minor starting point, the big vendors, Lenovo, Dell, HP, even Intel, had off-floor product demonstrations of their various machines. We'll probably pull a little more of that in later. But the ones I wanted to pull out in particular and note for this podcast was we knew that Qualcomm's Snapdragon X2 Elite chips were going to be a pretty major deal. Right now, we think that is a release late first quarter of 2026.
Now I think the Elites are out now. The Plus is the next one.
The Plus is the one.
And it's going to come out Q2.
Yeah, that's the one we're after, right?
Yeah.
And so what happened here is all of the big vendors, Dell and the XPS, Lenovo and some of their products, HP and multiple of their products, and others. There were 8 machines on the floor that had these processors in them. And the reason it's such
this is in the Qualcomm booth. And remember, this is an ARM processor that uses the chips more like the ones in your cell phone or your iPad. And it's not a processor that uses the traditional Intel AMD x86 model.
That's right. And we suspect the timing might be partially related to Windows 12. Don't know that in fact, but that's what it looks like. But the key here is battery life extended out to 40 hours, a week's worth of runtime.
Battery life is measured in days instead of hours.
And performance is increased. So those chips are very interesting. And later in the year, we'll have an update on computers for you because the new Panther Lake chips will also arrive. There'll be a bunch of new computers all kind of converging in late quarter one. But I thought it was very interesting that they put those on display there, along with some glasses, AR, VR glasses that were actually somewhat usable. I think I'm correct in saying there were 2 cases of 5 glasses apiece.
Yes. And some of those were truly the birth control glasses we see that look like the kind that are issued to Marine recruits at boot camp that are very functional and not very fashionable. But, and some of them, I saw one of them, it was a 1/2 inch thick. So, some of them were crazy, but there were some very interesting ones. There's one we saw at Showstoppers that was designed for macular degeneration. And so people with severe eye that needs really big zoomed in, they would put your prescription in there first, and then they had cameras in the front, and they would display the stuff that needed to be magnified at super high resolution on the lenses themselves.
Yeah. And that company out of Ohio seems to be pretty well funded. They've got a good vision of what they'd like to accomplish with that. So, and we actually talked about that specifically too, where like the name metaverse got opted away real quickly here. But these assistive glasses, I think, might have some useful purpose. Now,
Yes.
there is another minor infrastructure thing that, I was pleased to walk over to the booth, and that was the HDMI new cable. So, what are the key things that our listeners need to know about that?
Well, you've heard about 4K displays, and most of you probably have a 4K display somewhere in your life. The next generation is 8K, which is 4 times as big, 4 times more pixels than 4K. And then they actually have now designed these new cables that will support 16K, which is just obscenely huge. And, again, with those things, they're transmitting 96 gigabits per second across these HDMI cables. And so, we've seen in the past when we're doing extremely high res monitors, like some of the 5K displays Apple has and others, you have to use either an alternative cable or you have to use 2 HDMI cables. With these, it looks like you could run pretty much anything, and I think it was 16K at 120 frames a second or something insane. I mean, it was just more data than you could imagine.
So traditionally we've said, look, if you're buying HDMI cables, get the HDMI 2.1s. I'm thinking that, I'll reflect on it a little bit more, but right now, these new HDMI, 64, 96.
Yeah, the 96 gig, and they're through HDMI 3. Now, here's something to know about them, though, too. They're also very short. They have to be sub 6 feet if they use copper, and if they haven't made the special chips they need to take that amount of data, turn it into fiber, and then run it through to the other extension, like they did with the fiber cables we talked about a while back.
Yeah.
And by the way, so we expect those to come out sometime in Q2, Q3. So those will be available, and those will really be the call for many of you, because you'll be able to go out to 300 plus feet on those things.
And for your conference rooms and the like, that is the right way to get that job done. So notice that's a moving part that we wanted to be aware of. Now, the monitors that we saw this year, I think the most impressive ones were the ones done by CTX, not a vendor we've talked a lot about. But
I remember them back from the VGA and EGA days.
They've been around a long time.
Yeah.
And, LG also had a very interesting monitor. So I want to call out those two monitors for our listeners. The first one, though, is the CTX. And again, just think about what the listeners need to know on this one.
So this is a dual 27-inch display that opens up with like a clamshell, like a laptop. So you literally open this thing up, and there's two 27-inch displays that are running off of. There's basically a power cable connected, and then an HDMI cable connected to that, and they're running that off of that. Now, I did the math on it. I think you could put it in a rollerboard bag if you had to get it on an airplane and didn't want to check it. But realistically, it's just, you can't imagine how big it is. Now, one of the trends we did see is a trend toward more of these clamshell type second monitors. So you have 2 monitors, or maybe you get 2 of those and you have 4. And then it looks like you're some kind of pilot simulator or something. Yeah. But that switch to the clamshell that opens like this was a big shift that we saw.
Yeah, and we discussed that because the reason it actually makes sense is by being clamshell, the screens are protected while traveling.
And they're next to each other, and there's nothing in the middle.
So in effect, you can wind up with 3 screens quite conveniently that you can easily carry around. And we did see smaller ones. So where we've recommended, 15s and 17s to match your laptop, now think about having a clamshell multiple display which stands up.
And that 27 was clearly first gen. It was probably an inch thick on both sides, so it was extremely thick. And so it's not quite optimized yet, but it was still pretty impressive. And everybody that we saw that was doing monitors seemed to have an impressive one like that. And another thing happening with monitors is that the curved monitors now seem to be losing most of their bezel around the edges. That's of course the little kind of framing around the outside. And so the reason that's important is that if you're putting multiple of these together, you don't have those panes, the bezel there at the edge. that's not in there. So you can have almost all LCD to LCD instead of having LCD framing LCD.
Yeah. And in particular on this one, I wanted to call out the LG 39. Now, I've recommended 49-inch monitors to many of you who've emailed me, and everybody that I've put on the 49-inch curved LG says that's a deal. And it is, because it's the equivalent of two 27s and relatively inexpensive. This new 39-inch one that we were specifically shown had upscaling, which I thought was fascinating. And you took pictures of that for us, Brian. But basically, the monitor, 39-inch, was basically producing 4K, I think, on the left side and 5K on the right side through upscaling.
Yeah, and that was very impressive because it had its own technology inside that was taking the inferior output and smoothing up. And you've seen this in movies and things like this for a while, because if you're watching, say, your Blu-rays on a 4K TV, Blu-rays don't go up to 4K. They're just 1080p, as I recall. Maybe they're more.
There's some that are more.
There's some, but they are. The thing about the content is that the TVs will upscale them, and so now the monitors will do that too.
And the person who was explaining this to us didn't make any claims, but I'm listening to what he's saying and thinking to myself, okay, I'm running tax software, let's say UltraTax, and I've got downscaled resolution. I can upscale this on this right-hand side of this monitor. On this monitor, it would actually look right instead of looking wonky.
And that has huge implications for people that work remote, because in many cases they don't have an internet connection fast enough to, and again, if you think about a 1 gigabit connection, that's nowhere near the 96 gigabits that you need to support 16K. And so so again, we end up with not so many pixels in there, but the good news is if we can have the hardware upscale it, maybe, like you said, we can have the limited view and then have it show up and look actually pretty good.
Yeah. Well, one of the topics that we have planned for our K2 business this year is talking about how to bring more infrastructure back in-house, because the price performance of the cloud isn't paying off like some of the local, and some of the security is a factor. A vendor that you
and we have the internet connection as a potential bottleneck, even if you've got fiber.
Doesn't matter how fast it is.
Yeah.
And I believe it was 2 years ago, we ran into a vendor who's been around since 2012, but I believe 2 years ago was their first appearance here at CES. And they showed us a network attached storage device, which we talked about starting 2 years ago. And they introduced a variety of new products. So the product vendor is Ugreen, and they have three specific things that I want to call out. Now, we'll save a little bit of this for the AI podcast episode we'll do for you. But their new network attached storage devices were very impressive.
Yeah, the X6011 line.
And they have their SynCare video camera systems, which are entirely premise-based security systems, which were AI powered. That's important. And then they have a gallium nitride charger unit, which was all pretty fascinating stuff. So when we look at these evolution of their network attached storage devices, I believe it was 2024 when we saw those first Kickstarter NASs, and we asked if they would run Linux and VMware and Microsoft Windows, and they said yes. I'm thinking,
not knowing that VMware was going to commit suicide in the small business market.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
But
that's what it is. But it's like, oh, these could be the real deal. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out I think they are the real deal, and they have some very high performance drives for very little money, as it turns out. So their IDX 6011 Pro unit retail is going to be $2,600, but they're selling it right now for $1,559. That's a really good deal. It's a 6-bay NAS, and they also have some lower end units, but all of these are very capable network attached.
And the important thing to understand here is that these are designed to also do some AI workloads that we'll talk about later. But these things have, like, instead of 4 or 8 gigs of RAM, they have like 64 gigs of RAM. And instead of a Celeron or a low-end processor, instead they have i7s. So they can handle, they're more like light servers, kind of like the Windows Home servers were supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly. And they're running dual 10 gigabit ports in them, which was important. But also the AI piece Brian's talking about, We want to talk about that in the AI session that we'll do with you. But the vendor also was wise enough to put in a graphics processor port, and they called that the Oculink port, which allows you to connect external GPUs. So must have a vision that we're going to get real serious about running AI off of these noses. But the AI they were running without that external support was still pretty bloody impressive.
And I will say that the legal, you need to talk to your lawyer friends about using AI, because there have been some interpretations and rulings come out that said that they can't use AI that's not on premises and in their control.
So we want you to be aware, and we will talk more about that in the AI session, because their cameras and their AI and the Snapdragon AI, those are
like
all
doing facial recognition and crazy things.
those are all big deals. But the other little piece that they introduced was their desktop charger. And the thing can do 300 watts, and it can run all sorts of different connectors, USB-Cs and A's, and it will balance the load of charging. And it was very impressive little charging.
And I will tell you that I've been using about a 400 watt gallium nitride charger for a while, and it's great. I can run my laptop off of it and charge my phone and charge a tablet and do all that at the same time. Now, remember, just for perspective, if you're wondering, am I going to blow out my fuses? A 400 watt charger is about a quarter of what you pull when you do a 18 watt hair dryer. It's a little less than a quarter of that. So, realistically, it's still a lot of juice, but it's really quite different, because when the iPad chargers came out, that's a 10 watt charger. Okay, so we're talking about 30 times that.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Well, we'll talk more about the AI capabilities, and I probably should have pulled this comment in on AI too, because when we were talking about Qualcomm earlier, they have their very interesting Dragon Wing AI premises-based appliance that
Yes.
you can have custom work done on.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about accounting firms and accounting confidential information, and you want to run it locally, and there are partners that will customize those appliances. So, I'm looking at that saying, this is very interesting. But we intentionally came back here to the Venetian today because we were invited by a couple of representatives from Amazon, and those guys were very we met them at the TCL booth.
We were at the TCL booth looking at TCL's touch and note-taking tablet device, and that tablet device is just a beast. It's called the Note AI Text Paper, TXT paper, and it has an e-ink display. Now, the e-ink display only uses, this thing was a color display. It was a little more muted than a traditional display, but it was very high resolution, 120 hertz, so 120 frames per second, 2240 by 1440, 11.5-inch thing, 8,192 pressure levels. So it's, it's much better than an iPad. And the screen kind of has the friction that you're used to getting with a piece of paper and a pen. So there's that in there. It runs Android under the hood, 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage. It will also do PDF markup. It will connect up to OneDrive and Google. It also there's a version of Outlook that runs on it. So you can connect up with a native Outlook client or other Android apps.
Yeah, so the next paper we talked about last year in our sessions, and that was released about March, and we recommended throughout the year. But this new generation next paper is faster, and the handwriting on it was really superb. Brian tried to give you the specs there, but if you are using remarkable tablets which do not have the security profile that we want, or you're using iPads which are heavy and expensive, this device is just a winner. The prior version you could routinely get for around $200, and
this one comes in the mid 500s, but remember, this is a color device instead of a black and white.
Yeah.
And so that's a difference there. But it's it was impressive enough that the Amazon people were looking at it to figure out what they needed to do with their color Kindle that they should have.
Yeah. So I wanted to call out that particular infrastructure device, if you would, because that really brings us then over to Amazon, the reason we came back to the
Yeah.
mission today, because the Kindle guys had invited us over, and then we wandered through the rest of the Amazon display, which was worth our time.
It was.
And it turns out they had their Eero wireless gateways there.
And there is a new Eero power over Ethernet gateway that looks more small business grade. It looks like something that you would actually use in a small business as opposed to something consumer that you made work in a business.
Yeah, so Eero has been one of the devices we've recommended in home offices, and there are certain types of security things that we worry about, but that was a pretty good thing. Also, their Amazon Ring cameras.
And they have the new Ring Elite cameras that do 90, 120, 180, 270, even 360 degrees off of those. And they're much beefier. I actually read online that they now have one of those 360-degree cameras like you have deployed at a lot of malls to reduce to at least capture the crime that takes place. So there are a lot of really impressive things there. One thing that we saw that was kind of disappointing to us was that the Amazon Sidewalk, their Wi-Fi sharing thing that's in the Amazon Echo, you still have to opt out of it. Okay, so we were wondering to ourselves, did they kill that off because it's such a security hole for businesses? But they have not. And so you have to opt out of that. And that's another reason why we think that you should be running all your Internet of Things devices on their own separate network that is completely segregated from anything confidential.
Yeah. But one other thing that was, I'm going to say, a little bit of a surprise to me, but not horribly big surprise, Amazon Leo.
Yes.
Because I didn't realize that they had receivers that they were promoting. And let me see if I can get the names right. Nano, Pro, and Ultra.
Yes, and these things they're called composite antennas. And so instead of being made up of one single antenna, this is made up of hundreds of very micro antennas that all work together, almost like bees work together as a single organism, even though there are, thousands of lives doing that.
Yeah, so as it turns out, we've been fans of low Earth orbit satellites, and I use Starlink for quite some time. They're in their 4th generation now on that product. But this evolution is their Project Kuiper, and right now I think they have about 180 satellites out of about 3,000 that they hand.
Bezos has not had the luck or the skill that Musk has had in getting his stuff. Musk has 9,300 to 9,500 satellites right now, and Bezos has 180. Now, 180 is still pretty impressive. It's 180 more things in low Earth orbit than I've ever put there. But at the same time, it takes hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites to cover the entire Earth. And that's what we want you to understand is this is going here quickly. Now, the composite antenna that they have, their Leo antenna, is actually, they say, is the best antenna ever, and it can theoretically receive speeds up to 1 gig down and send upward to space up to 400 megs up. So up to 1 gig down, 400 megs up, which is pretty impressive because your Starlink, you went 100 down and 25 up. Is that right?
That's about it.
Yeah, and so that's more akin to a traditional entry-level cable connection that you have at home, but it's still amazing when you're working with places where you don't have reliable connections.
Yeah. So we wanted to spend a little time on these business infrastructure things because here in 26, your computers are changing, processing power is headed out to the edge in your phones and in your computers.
But it's heading to the edge for privacy reasons and not because it can't be done in the cloud, but it's for privacy and security.
And speed to a degree.
Yes.
And one other thing that was promoted but not broadly visible was Wi-Fi 8. ASUS had units. TP-Link claimed to have units, but I could not locate them in their booth, and the people there said the others assigned, but that's about all we got out of it.
Yeah.
But we know that wireless is going to continue to evolve, plus 6P will continue to evolve this year. And if I'm right on that call, we'll just have a single chip doing 6 in our units, which will give us Wi-Fi 7, cellular, Bluetooth, all in a single chip. That's why that 6 is so important in my mind, because it's really, we're going from cellular 5 to cellular 6.
Yeah, it's an interesting time now. There's a whole lot less risk taking in here. It's clear that the tariffs did have an impact on, and the trade wars that have been going on have had a negative impact on some of the investments and things like that. That having been said, we have to remember that there was still up through November up through, I guess, November of 2004, we had all that uncertainty around the election. We didn't know what was going to happen. And then once the election happened, we still didn't know what was going to happen. So last year when we were here, President Biden was still in office and President Trump had said he was going to do some things, but we hadn't seen what he was going to be able to do. And so there was still huge uncertainty hanging over things now. We now have different uncertainty. So it's, again, I don't mean to weigh in on politics here, but it's this, whenever we try to adjust the barriers of trade, it has a negative impact in the short term on the economy,
on the technologies in particular. In fact,
the supply chains in particular,
and the AI memory consumption right now is affecting the price of memory chips, and they're headed up. So again, we'll try to monitor those things and talk to you about them in future podcasts. But we wanted to give you an idea of what was happening with the infrastructure from CES. And we'll talk to you again in another Accounting Technology Lab very soon.
Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.